Great. Well, good morning, everybody. Everybody well? Some people are well. Good. Well, my name is Rich. As I said, if you're visiting us this morning, if you're here for the first time, if you're not normally with us, welcome. It's really nice to have you with us this morning. Open your Bibles, please, at the book of Daniel. Whilst you're doing that, I don't know if that's just been said or not. I might have missed it, dropping Olivia off. But the church family meeting is this coming Wednesday. Healthy families communicate well together. So we want to be a church as a healthy family that communicates well. So this coming Wednesday, we've got a church family meeting in the hall next door, 7:45, sort of Christian mean time, isn't it? 7:45, but tea and coffee, I think, available just before as well. We're going to worship together a little bit, and then we're going to spend time just sharing one or two key things of the areas of the life of the church for this term, for the year ahead. We don't want our Sunday mornings to be mornings of notices, endless things. So we want to take a little bit of time on Wednesday to share on a few key areas. Ali Rice, remember Ali? Ali Rice, who was part of this church for many years, for several years, and running our youth for several years before he left us in the summer. He's going to come back. He's going to be with us on Wednesday, and he's going to take a moment to share his news, how he's got on in Cyprus over the last few months, and what God's got for him in the next season of his life. He didn't quite work to do that with all the Christmas services the last few Sundays, so we said, come this Wednesday. And for reasons that will become clear on Sunday, he's not available on Sundays so easily. So he's going to come and do that among us on Wednesday. It'd be great to hear from Ali. Also, I just wanted to underline again this book. I'm sure a number of us have this book, Wind and Wells by Jeff Norwich here. A number of us might not have this book. It's a really good book which tells the story, really Jeff and Mary's own personal story, as well as in many ways it tells the story of the beginnings of this church community, which started about 50 years ago. So around 50 years that this church community kicked off. And actually, in God's providence, God put it on Jeff's heart last year to put it down on paper. So if you haven't bought this book, please buy it. This coming Wednesday, Jeff's going to come with a stash of books ready to sell. It's only £8. What's that? Price of a couple of flat whites with extra oat milk. £8, that's all it is. It's a super book, really easy to read. As I say, it tells the story of the past of our church, but also it gives faith for the next 50 years, I think. So please, if you haven't got it, come and be ready to buy on Wednesday, or just go to Jeff and say, please, can I buy one of your books? As I said, the book of Daniel is where we are this morning and where we're going to be for the coming months. To enter the book of Daniel is to enter a strange new world. It is not Whitney in the 21st century. We go to Babylon in 600 years before the birth of Jesus. It's a book of prophecies, of visions of beasts and animals and statues. It's a book of angels, of kings going mad. It's a book of near-death experiences. It's a book of actual death experiences. It's obviously a book of lions and fiery furnaces. It's quite a book. And it's where we're going to be as a church between now and Easter, more or less. A couple of weeks after Christmas, we're opening chapter 1 today. A couple of weeks before Easter, we're going to close the final chapter 12. So what I want to do this morning, the next half an hour or so, is just kind of outline the book, give a bit of an overview of the book. What's the book about? Where are we? What are the themes of this book? And we'll also, just as we do that, we'll look at the first 2 verses of the book of Daniel. Most weeks we'll do about a chapter a week. Today it's just the first couple of verses. So let's do an overview of this book together. First question to ask ourselves is, I don't know how well this will work this morning, is the style. What style, maybe you can do it for me, Debbie. What's the style of the book of Daniel? Well, I've just listed off some of the funny things we have in this book. It's a book of action, and in many ways, it is a Bible within a Bible. The Bible is made up of different genres. We get the law books, the first few books of the Bible that tell the laws which were given to the Old Testament people. We get narrative books of the Bible, which tells the histories, the stories of the people of God. We get poetry sections of the Bible. We get prophetic books of the Bible. We then get the New Testament. We get Gospels that tell the accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus. We get letters, and then we get also apocalyptic books, particularly the book of Revelation. When you open the book of Daniel, you kind of get most of that in one book. There are obviously narrative sections, a little bit like the books of Chronicles and Kings. There are prophetic sections, certainly, a bit like the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah. There are poetry sections. If you look at the middle of chapter 2, there's a beautiful psalm which could easily find itself in the book of Psalms. There are apocalyptic sections, which are a little bit like the book of Revelation, which speak of the end of the world and use unusual images to describe things that are going to happen at the end of the world. And at the center of the book of Daniel, like at the center of the Bible, is Jesus. Chapter 7 of Daniel is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the whole of the Old Testament. Daniel has a vision, and he sees God the Father in his vision, who he calls the Ancient of Days. And alongside God the Father, he sees Jesus. He calls one like a son of man. Daniel sees Jesus. There's not a chapter like that in the rest of the Old Testament. At the heart of this book is Jesus. Like at the heart of the Bible is Jesus. Some of the sections are really easy to understand. They're like stories we tell kids. Some of the sections are a little bit more complicated to understand, which is much like the whole of the Bible, isn't it? There are sections of the Bible which are really quite straightforward to understand, and sections which are somewhat more difficult. There are sections which even Daniel didn't understand. If you look at the last chapter of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 8 of Daniel, Daniel, an old man by this time, says, verse 8 of chapter 12, I heard, but I didn't understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will be the outcome of all this? I heard, but I didn't understand. Do you ever read the Bible and think, I can read that, but I don't understand that? There are sections of this book which are tricky, but we're going to go through all of it between now and Easter. So the book has a bit of everything, but it is part of the major prophets in our book, in the book of the Bible. So last year, as a church, we looked at the minor prophets, Amos and Malachi and the others. Daniel is part of the major prophets, major in length, not more important, but Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Lamentations, and Daniel. He falls into that category. However, in the earliest form of the Hebrew Bible, Daniel was actually put in the narrative section, which kind of immediately tells us this is a book which sort of crosses genres. So what's the style of the book? It is a Bible within a Bible. What about the structure of the book of Daniel? Well, it is a book of two halves. It's FA Cup weekend, I think. It's a book of two halves. There we go. It's a book that falls neatly into two equal parts, chapters 1 to 6 and chapters 7 to 12. Chapters 1 to 6 relate incidents happening to Daniel and his friends in Babylon and are quite easy to understand on the whole. Chapters 7 to 12 recount 4 visions which came to Daniel in his old age. And guess what? They're a bit trickier to understand. The first half is mainly about miracles, and the second half of the book is mainly about prophecies. The book starts with Daniel as a young man, probably 15 or 16 in Daniel chapter 1. One of our boys celebrated his 16th birthday last week. That's the age of Daniel as we start Daniel chapter 1. But when we get to the end of the book, he's well into his 9th decade. And the book of Daniel really spans much of Daniel's lifetime. Just for those who are interested, the book is written in 2 languages. It's written in Hebrew and it's written in Aramaic. 99% of the Old Testament is written in the Hebrew language, the language of the Jews. 99% of the New Testament is written in Greek, the language of the world at that time. But when we come to Daniel, it is a mix of Hebrew and Aramaic. Hebrew was the language of the Jewish people. Aramaic was the lingua franca of the world at that time. If you wanted to communicate to everybody, you chose Aramaic. A little bit like today, you'd probably choose English. So there's chunks of the book which is in Hebrew, clearly intended for the Jewish audience. And then there's chunk which are written in Aramaic, clearly intended for, everybody's got to hear this bit. This is like our global news that Daniel wants to communicate. And we do think that the book was written by Daniel. That seems the most likely of possibilities. The first half of the book is in the third person. So Daniel, he. And the second half of the book is written in the first person, Daniel, I. So the book is written by Daniel as well as being a book about Daniel. That's the style. That's the structure. What about the setting of this book? Where are we? Or when are we? Well, actually, we know exactly where we are. It's one of the books of the Bible where there's no doubt what year we're in, what city we're in. And in fact, the very first verse of the book of Daniel tells us where we are and when we are. Let's just read the first couple of verses of Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and we know when he reigned, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. We know we're in 605 BC. We can be that specific, and we can see that we're in Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq, modern-day southern Iraq. People of God starts with Abraham. Abraham called by God to be a blessing to the nations. He has a son, Isaac, who has a son, Jacob, who has lots of sons, 12 of them. Jacob's also known as Israel. Jacob ends up living in Egypt. Several hundred years pass by, and the little family of Abraham are now a nation. Over 1 million people living in Egypt who are the Jewish people, but they're under slavery when we read the beginnings of the book of Exodus. And God redeems the people. He takes them out of slavery. Wonderful picture of God taking us out of slavery to sin. God takes the people of God out of slavery to Pharaoh and into the desert. They spend 40 years in the desert. God gives them the law, shows them his heart. He says, you're my people, I'm your God. Eventually, they enter the promised land, the land promised by God to this people, where they spend around 400 years. That's the period of the judges, and the people of Israel are then separated into 12 tribes, or organized into 12 tribes from the 12 sons of Jacob. After this period, God raises up a king. He starts to raise up kings to rule his people. Those kings are, first of all, Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. They reign under the very first United Kingdom, UK, which is Israel. They were under a united kingdom altogether. After Solomon dies, though, that's it. Civil war. And the 12 tribes split up. And we get 10 tribes who form a kingdom in the north, generally called Israel, and then we get just 2 of the tribes that form a kingdom in the south, which are generally called Judah. Northern kingdom of Israel lasts for about 200 years before the Assyrian army, the big empire of the time, conquers them. And the southern kingdom of Judah lasts about 325 years before Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, when Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem and invades the city. And he came and he attacks Jerusalem in 3 different moments. The first time he comes is here, chapter 1, verse 1, 605 BC. He comes to Jerusalem, he starts to take off people, which we'll see in a moment, and he brings them to him, Babylon. He even takes, as we read here, the elements of the temple, and he puts them in his temple. He begins the process of deporting the Jewish people from Jerusalem to Babylon. That's in 605 BC. 597, just a few years later, we're counting down, obviously. There's a second attack of Jerusalem. More exiles are taken, including Ezekiel. And then in 586 BC, a third and final attack of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's destroyed, the temple's destroyed, the last Jewish people are deported from Jerusalem, and they're dumped in Babylon. And Jeremiah is among those in that third wave. He's a little bit younger than Daniel. So suddenly the Jews, there's a timeline, suddenly the Jews are no longer living in Jerusalem. After centuries and centuries of living in the promised land, it's gone. And they find themselves living in Babylon. And they stay there for 70 years. And that period of 70 years starts in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. And it ends really by Daniel chapter 12, more or less. And we call that period the Exodus. The book of Daniel covers that period of the Exodus. If you think of the book of Nehemiah, a little bit later, that's after when they're allowed to go back to the land and they come back to Jerusalem, this place they haven't seen for 70 years, and it's all destroyed and broken. Let's rebuild the city walls. So Daniel's just a bit before Nehemiah during this period of the exile. So that's the structure of this book. What about the substance of the book of Daniel? What are the key themes of this wonderful book of Daniel? I want to suggest three key themes of the book of Daniel, which we need to have in mind as we read this over the next 3 months, as well as just for this morning. 3 big themes of the book of Daniel. First thing, being faithful to God in an alien culture. The Jews find themselves in Babylon, far from the promised land. Just like many thousands of people today find themselves as refugees around the world because they're no longer allowed to live in their state. Just like thousands of people still today get deported every now and then and put into a new place. So the Jews were deported and found themselves in Babylon. And their great challenge was, well, how do we be Jews when we're no longer in Jerusalem? How do we be faithful to God when we're no longer in Jerusalem? If you just turn in your Bibles to the book of Psalms, we'll read a similar psalm to one Jeff read earlier, Psalm 137. Lots of the psalms are written by David, a lot earlier during that United Kingdom, that UK bit. But there are other psalms written at different points of the period of Israel, including some psalms which were written during their 70-year exile period. And Psalm 137 is an example of that. Psalm 137 verse 1 says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." Zion being a word for Jerusalem. "There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of your songs of Zion.'" So these Jewish people are stuck in Babylon. They're not in their home anymore. They're refugees, and they've got their tormentors, Nebuchadnezzar's henchmen, saying, "Hey, come on, sing us one of your songs. Sing us one of your Jewish songs from Jerusalem." Probably some blatant anti-Semitism going on. Come on, sing along. Hey, you've come from Jerusalem. Oh yeah, your temple's not there anymore, is it? How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? How can we possibly sing those songs from Jerusalem when we're stuck in Babylon? How, as Christians, do we be faithful to Jesus when we live in a country that is indifferent, skeptical, hostile to the message of Jesus? Our citizenship is in heaven, isn't it? How do we live as faithful to the fact that our citizenship is in heaven when we live on earth? That's a huge challenge, isn't it? It's a massive challenge for them, massive challenge for us. And the answer is partly found, only partly, but partly found in the principles that governed the life of Daniel and his friends. Principles of prayer and discipline and grace and humility and faith and obedience and courage. So the book of Daniel isn't written to comfort a people who are suffering or being persecuted. Rather, it's written to us people who are living in a settled condition, yet within an alien culture. We don't live in North Korea, do we? Or Mauritania, or Iran, where you can be killed and persecuted for it. We live in a nation which, as I said, is hostile, cynical, indifferent at best sometimes. Well, how do we be fervently passionate for Christ in that culture around us? A few weeks ago, 330 MPs, democratically elected men and women, essentially voted for euthanasia in our country. They were probably good. A lot of those would be good-hearted people, not like evil MPs, but that's their mindset. 250,000 babies were aborted last year in the UK. Live in a country that says marriage between a man and a woman? I don't think so. How do we be faithful to the principles of Scripture, the heart of God, within a culture which is different? First big theme of this book, being faithful to God in an alien culture. Second big theme of this book is very simply the sovereignty and the power of God. The sovereignty and the power of God. If you go back, these two little verses in Daniel chapter 1, they tell us an awful lot. They tell us an awful lot. They explain King Nebuchadnezzar's attack on Jerusalem, the attack that happened in 3 stages, this being the first of those 3. Verse 1 describes the attack in terms of like secular history. Verse 2 describes it in terms of biblical history. Verse 1 is Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, man's perspective. It says, Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem, he attacked Jerusalem, he's active. Verse 2, exact same event, is God's perspective. It says how God gave the city of Jerusalem into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. God is active. Who decided that you would live in Whitney, all the villages around? Now, was that your decision? Is that your wife's decision? Thank you, Greg. Or was it God's decision? Like yes and yes. It's both, isn't it? Like the mystery of God's overarching sovereignty mixed with our free will and our free choice. Who set this church up? Was it Jeff, Mary, and or was it the Lord? Or was it others? Oh, it's both. It's both, isn't it? There's secular history and there's biblical history. So these 2 versions, verse 1 and 2, they're versions of the same event, but from 2 perspectives. History's account and God's account. And the 2 perspectives are then woven together through the rest of the book. How man's actions mixes with the actions of the sovereign God. It's worth just saying, Nebuchadnezzar, he goes on a real journey in the book of Daniel. A powerful, quite moving journey. But at the beginning, he is not a very nice chap. If you just turn a few pages back to the book of Jerusalem, the book of Jeremiah, which is a couple of books back, not from Ezekiel. Yeah. If you go to Jeremiah 39, we read of the fall of Jerusalem in its first stage, when Nebuchadnezzar came for the first time. Actually, no, sorry, the third time. The fall of Jerusalem at the end, the third time. If you just read in verse 5 of Jeremiah 39. But the Babylonian army pursued them, the king and his people, and overtook Zedekiah, who was the king, in the plains of Jericho. They captured the king. And they took him to our friend Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, where he pronounced sentence on him. There at Riblah, the king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah, the king, before his eyes, and also killed all the nobles of Judah. Then he put out Zedekiah, the king's eyes, gouged his eyes out, and bound him with bronze shackles to take him to Babylon. So that's the account of how he murdered the sons of the king in front of his eyes. And then he immediately gouged out the eyes of the king. Why? Because the last image that king has in his mind is his sons being murdered. That's Nebuchadnezzar. That is this dictator who is in action here. Over the next few weeks, we'll see him go on a real journey, even a journey of faith, which involves all sorts of quite dramatic things in his life. But at the beginning, this is a wicked man, or at least a man behaving wickedly. One of the big themes of the book, and indeed all of Scripture then, is man's actions mixed with God's sovereignty. And we can pose a question right at the beginning of our study, and maybe the exiles pose the question, who's in charge? Like, who is in charge of the world? Is it kings and dictators? Yes, they seem to be pretty powerful. Is it presidents and prime ministers? Is it governments? Is it big business? Is it big tech? Or is it God? Is it actually Yahweh, the God of Israel, who's in charge? So Nebuchadnezzar is active, but so is God. And he's working out his purposes in the world for the good of his people and for his glory. Nebuchadnezzar's defeat of Jerusalem couldn't have been more emphatic, more complete as the years went on. He destroyed the city, and then we read there in verse 2 that he brought God's possessions, and the verses that followed explain how he captured some of the people, and he brought them and he put them in Babylon. He took God's possessions, God's sacred, holy possessions that were for exclusive use in the temple, and he put them in his temple. Like, if that isn't a declaration of, I'm in charge here. You think your temple's important? Well, I've just knocked it down. And I'll take your best bits of gold and I'll put them in where they should go. My temple to my gods. This is the ultimate, my dad's bigger than your dad. Like, my God's bigger than your God. So if you read verse 1, you think, yeesh, this is disaster. If you read verse 2, you think, maybe God's at work here. Maybe he's actually at work with his people. There are two hands at work, that of man and that of God. Probably like most people in the room, I'm right-handed. So I have a dominant hand. I can do some things with my left hand. I can write a bit, but it'll look pretty scrawly. I have a dominant hand. Like Nebuchadnezzar had a certain amount of power, but there is a dominant hand at work, like an overarching hand. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar can pull out eyes of people, and he can destroy temples, and he can deport nations, but actually there's another hand that's even stronger. There's like a dominant hand at work. We sang earlier, your name is the highest. Your name is the greatest. That is, English teachers will tell me, the superlative, correct? I.e., we're comparing something. There is like some great names. There are some high names. But there's one who's higher and greater. There are some strong hands, but there are some dominant hands. Or there's a dominant hand, and it's the dominant hand of the God of Israel who's right here. Verse 2 is a pretty astonishing sentence when you think about it. God himself was involved in the defeat of his own people and the overthrow of his own city. Like, put that in your pipe and smoke it. God was involved in their pain. The reality is that the Israelites were guilty. They had spent decades, centuries, rebelling against God, ignoring him, rebelling against his covenant. The prophets had said again and again and again, if you don't change, you'll go into exile. Like, there is consequence to endless sin. Verse 2 is simply God being faithful to his word. But in the kindness of God, it's a 70-year period. They come back. It's not the end of the story. Being faithful to God in an alien culture. How do we sing the song of the Lord when those around us are singing a different song? The sovereignty and the power of God. A final big theme for us to have in mind this morning, us to have in mind as we go through this over the next few weeks and months, is simply that of godly character. Godly character. We haven't yet met Daniel this morning, but running alongside these two big themes, we will see a wonderful example of a godly man in this person, and his friends as well, alongside him. Daniel is a hero. He was a brave man, an outstanding example of godliness. Such heroism didn't develop overnight. It doesn't normally, does it? He proves himself in the little things. We'll come next week to the rest of chapter 1, and we'll see that Daniel passes test number 1 next week, before much more serious tests come along. He's a man of discipline and prayer and humility and servanthood, like those really unglamorous things which build character. About 16 years ago, almost to the day, there was a really unusual news story. You might remember, I imagine we'll all remember, how US Airways Flight 1549 made an emergency landing in the Hudson River in New York after flocks of geese destroyed, I think, caused both jet engines to fail. Remember that? So dramatic, wasn't it? Just gently touching next to Manhattan. 115 people on board, all just walked out of the plane onto the river. The incident came to be known as the Miracle on the Hudson. Was it a miracle, though? Did God miraculously intervene, override humans, and save those people? Yes. Did he also use individuals who were there at the time to save those people? Yes. Tell you the story of the man at holding the pilot controls, Chelsea Solly Sullenberger III. It's a good name. He'd been flying since he was 16. In 1969, Sully enrolled as a student of the US Air Force Academy. As a freshman, he was one of 12 selected for a glider program. A year later, he became a glider instructor. After graduating from the academy, he then served in the Air Force as a fighter pilot for 5 years, earning the rank of captain. He became a commercial pilot in 1980 and was almost 58 when he landed Flight 1549 in the Hudson. He'd been flying planes for more than 40 years. Sully was neither relying on spontaneous virtue nor consulting a rule book. He spent years developing the character and skills required to handle the situation. Lifetime of practice equipped him to land an engineless plane and remain calm in a crisis. That's the story of that guy, Sully. That is the story of Daniel. When you get to chapter 6, we'll get to in 7 weeks' time, Daniel the lion's den. Daniel's an old man in Daniel chapter 6. He's probably 80 when he chucks in with those lions. He spent decades fostering character. The reason he gets thrown in the lion's den is because he's got a discipline of prayer that he's not going to give up. Character doesn't just develop overnight, does it? Any of us looking to grow in godliness? Daniel is a wonderful model to follow. Wonderful model of Christ-likeness 600 years before Christ walked the earth. So that's the book of Daniel. And that's where we're going in the next few weeks. I just want to finish by asking a question. What season are you in? If you just look at chapter 2, verse 20. We're going to come to chapter 2 in a couple of weeks. Daniel has just received miraculously from God the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar's had and an interpretation that goes with it. In the end of verse 19, it says, Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and he deposes them." Beautiful psalm goes on. But he says in verse 21, he changes times and seasons. We're always in a season. It's been very obvious this week what season we've been in. Nobody doubted it. Nobody thought we were in summer. We're always in a season. Just want to ask at the beginning of this series and as we meet this morning, what season are you in? If you just look at these three main themes of this book, which of these particularly corresponds to the season of life that you're in? Being faithful to God in an alien culture. How many of us actually, we need to learn again how to sing the song of the Lord in a foreign land? How many of us need to stand up and say, Lord, I'm going to be a Daniel for you. In my workplace, where they use this horrible language and they mock Christianity, I want to be a Daniel again. In my family, where they take the mickey out of me because I go to church every Sunday, I want to be a Daniel. In my friendship group, and my college group, and my school, I want to be a Daniel, Lord. I want to learn how to better sing the song of the Lord in this foreign land. I think some of us are in that season. Chance to respond in a moment. Secondly, how many of us are in the I need to see the sovereignty of God season? Need to see something of the hand, the dominant hand of God in my life. A season where you need to see afresh that God is in control. That isn't just a Christian cliche. He is in control of his world, even if it might seem to be the opposite. Message of the book of Daniel and of the life of the Daniel is God is in control. He is sovereign. Terrible things happen in the world sometimes. Terrible people like Nebuchadnezzar do terrible things. Doesn't mean God's not in control. We might make poor life decisions. It's not always everyone else's fault, is it? Sometimes we make poor life decisions that have consequences, but God is still in control. There might be unexpected illness through no fault of our own. God is still in control. There might be unexpected relational struggles around us. God is still in control. He is still sovereign. Nebuchadnezzar's at work, but so is the hand of God is at work as well. As darkness fell and Jesus' body went limp, and those 12 disciples had long since scarpered, it looked like that was it. God had lost. You wait 3 days, oh no. There's someone much stronger than the Nebuchadnezzars of Jesus' day. The Pilates and the Herods and the Judas. And it's Yahweh who proved it again 2,000 years ago. And that is the template of Christian living. That Yahweh is the strongest. Whatever today holds, whatever this week holds, whatever this year holds, and anything could happen in the next 12 months. Whatever this year holds, his hand is always at work. And maybe some of us this morning, you say, Lord, I need to see your hand at work. I can't see it. I can only see Nebuchadnezzar's hand. I need to see your power and your strength and your breakthrough in my life afresh. I think some of us, that's the season that we're in. Thirdly, some of us are in it's time to grow in character season. It's time to grow in godliness, Christ-likeness season. Some of us in the room, it's just like, our head's just above water. If someone starts saying you need to grow in patience and self-control, like, no, go away. Some of us, no, we're fine. Our head is well above water. And actually, it's time to get growing again. In the fruit of the Spirit, in godliness, in humility, in obedience to Christ. Let's journey with Daniel, this Christ-like example of godly character. You happy to come up, Anna? And any musicians who are still in the room? I want us to finish our morning by responding to this word and responding to these three themes. As I say, I think many of us were in one of these seasons. And what we love to do is close our meeting in a moment, or before we close it, by praying for one another. Those of us who need to stand up and start being a Daniel again around the culture around you. Those of us who need to say, Lord, I am sinking at the moment. I need to see something of your power. Would you help me? Life is not straightforward. And then those of us in the room who need to stand up and say, Lord, I want to grow in godliness. I am not settling for where I am today in my walk with you. I want to keep your sanctifying work, keep working in my life. Can we stand together? Anna and the team are going to lead us in worship. As I said, the heart of this book is Jesus, Daniel chapter 7. The heart of any response has to be focusing on God, focusing on Christ together. Let's worship. Then in a minute, I'm going to come and pray for us. I'm going to invite anyone who wants to be prayed for, because you fall into one of these three seasons, to come forward, and we're going to lay hands and we're going to pray for one another. And trust that the God of Daniel, the God of Israel, will meet us as we pray.